The envelope was not addressed to anyone. That was the first thing Darnell noticed when he found it tucked beneath the windshield wiper of his cruiser years ago in the parking lot of the 4th Precinct on a night so cold the exhaust from every idling engine rose in long white columns toward the sky. He had been 31 years old then, still in uniform, still learning the shape of a career he would give his life to, and the envelope had held nothing more than a hand-drawn card from a child at the community centre where the precinct hosted its annual toy drive. Inside was a crayon drawing of a police officer with an oversized badge and a smile that took up half the face, and beneath it, in the careful block letters of a 7-year-old, the words, "You kept us safe." He had kept that card, tucked it into his locker, then eventually into his desk at home when he made detective. Then into the shoebox he moved from apartment to apartment, and finally into the small house on Calder Street where he lived alone now, 64 years old, 3 years into retirement, with a pension that covered his modest needs and a quiet he had never quite grown used to. What Darnell Price did with the last week of November and the first 3 weeks of December in the year he turned 64, no one at the 4th Precinct knew. Not yet, and what it cost him he had never once considered a cost at all. The family across the street from him on Calder Street was named Okafor. Renee Okafor was 38, a home health aide who left her house at 6 in the morning, 6 days a week, came home after dark, and spent the hours in between tending to a woman in her 80s named Mrs. Clifton, who did not always remember Renee's name but always reached for her hand when she heard her voice. Renee had 3 children. Marcus was 14 and already taller than Darnell, a quiet, serious boy who walked his younger siblings to the school bus every morning and held his little sister's hand without being asked. Though at 14 you are not supposed to need to be asked to do things like that, and most boys that age do need to be asked. Deja was 11 and kept a notebook she carried everywhere, filling it with drawings of buildings and bridges she said she was going to design one day. And the drawings were not the casual doodles of a child, but something more deliberate, structures with dimensions, noted in the margins in a small, careful hand. And Cody was 6, round-faced and gap-toothed, and he believed, with the full and unquestioned conviction of a 6-year-old, that the retired man across the street, who sometimes waved to him from the porch, was the most interesting person in the world because he had once mentioned in passing that he used to carry a badge. Darnell had lived on Calder Street for 9 years. He had known the Okafor family for 7 of them. Since Renee had moved in 2 months after her husband, a warehouse supervisor named Jerome, had gone to work one Thursday morning and not come home, taken by a blood clot at 41 that the doctors said they had never seen coming. Darnell had not made a point of getting close. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into other people's grief. He had knocked on the door 3 days after Jerome's funeral with a container of his mother's cornbread recipe and a quiet acknowledgement that he was around if anything needed fixing. 7 years later he had fixed the porch rail twice, rehung a door that would not close against winter drafts, and stood in Renee's kitchen on the night Marcus got into a fight at school and needed someone to explain to a 14-year-old what a man owed the world without lecturing him into a wall. What Darnell knew about November of that year he had learned in pieces. A conversation at the mailbox when Renee, still in her aide's uniform at 7 in the evening, had mentioned that the agency was cutting her hours after Mrs. Cliff decided to bring in a full-time live-in for the holidays and reduce Renee's days to 4. That was $22 fewer a day. He had noted it the way he noted everything, quietly and without reacting, just filed it somewhere behind his eyes where he kept the things that mattered. Then there had been the morning 3 weeks before Thanksgiving when Cody had come running across the street to show Darnell a permission slip for a class holiday party and had mentioned, with no awareness that it mattered, that he had told his teacher he probably could not bring anything because his mom said money was tight right now. Darnell had taken the permission slip, told Cody he would return it, and stood on his porch for a long time after the boy went back inside. He knew what tight right now meant. He had spent 31 years learning to read what people left out of their sentences. He had grown up in a house where that phrase was a season, not a circumstance, and his mother had used it the way other people used the weather, to explain why the lights were off or why dinner was smaller than it should have been. He went inside, sat at his kitchen table, and pulled out his bank statements from the last 6 months. His pension came to roughly $2,100 each month. His mortgage had been paid off 3 years before he retired. His bills, a man living alone, were modest. What he found, when he looked at the column of what he had saved across the year, was a number he had not fully registered until that moment: $3,800. Not wealth, not by any measure that the world used. Sitting in the account of a retired detective who ate simply, drove a 12-year-old car, and had no particular wants, it was just a number. Sitting across the street from a woman working 4 days a week and 3 children who needed Christmas, it was something else entirely. He did not tell Renee what he was planning. He would not have known how to say it without making her feel the particular shame that comes from being seen in need by someone you respect, and Renee Okafor had a composure and a pride that Darnell understood because he had been raised by a woman who had the same quality. His mother had accepted help exactly once in her life, from a church deacon who replaced their furnace the winter Darnell was 8, and she had fed that man dinner every Sunday for 6 months until she was certain the debt was settled. Renee would have said no, so Darnell did not ask. He started quietly, the way he had always worked best. The first Saturday of December he drove to the big box store on Route 9 in the early morning before the crowds came, pushing a cart through aisles lit too brightly for the hour, his reading glasses on, moving through the toy section with a purpose that made 2 different employees ask if he needed help finding something. He had his list, written in his own tight block print, on a notepad from his kitchen drawer. He had thought about it for 3 days before he wrote it down. Cody believed in everything, so Cody needed something that believed back. And Darnell chose a set of wooden building blocks with real metal connectors, not the cheap plastic kind, and a picture book about the dog that solved mysteries because 6-year-olds with round faces and gap teeth should have books about dogs that solve things. Deja's notebook was full of bridges, so Deja needed real tools, specifically a drafting set with actual metal instruments in a hinged case, a set of architectural sketchbooks with the grid printed fine and dense the way professional designers use, and 2 books on famous bridges that were written for adults but clearly. Marcus's silence held more than it let out, which meant Marcus needed something that returned as much as it received. So Darnell chose a leather journal, not the cheap kind with a flimsy spine, and a paperback collection of the kind of long, serious novels that a boy who is already older than his age reaches for when he finds out they exist. He spent $412 in that store, and loaded the car carefully and drove home through the December cold with the heater making its small, steady sound. He wrapped everything in the back bedroom that no one had slept in for years, using plain brown paper and the round, cheerful handwriting he had practiced twice on scrap paper to make sure it looked nothing like his own tight print. He labelled each package, "From a neighbour who believes in your family." No signature. He carried them across the street that night after 11, when the street was dark and the last light in the Okafor house had been off for an hour, and set them on the porch mat in the order a child would find them. He watched from his dark living room window to be sure they found them in the morning. Cody found them first at 6:50, still in his pajamas, and the sound he made was the sound of a child for whom wonder has not yet been complicated by anything. He was not finished. That was the thing that none of the people who would eventually hear this story quite understood at first. The packages on the porch were not the sum of what Darnell decided to do that December. He had a number in mind, not because he had calculated what the gesture required, but because he had calculated what the family needed. He thought about it the way he used to think about a case, the same way he had always started, asking himself what was actually missing here, and what would it take to fill it. Renee's reduced hours meant a shortfall of roughly $440 for November and December. Combined, her heating bill would run higher with 3 children in the house all day during the school break. The holiday party at Cody's school had a $10 per family contribution for the shared food table. Marcus had been wearing the same jacket for 2 winters, a thing Darnell had noticed because a detective notices what does not change when it should. And the jacket's zipper was pulling at the left seam in the way zippers pull when the weight of 2 winters has worked on them. Cody needed boots, the heavy kind, because the ones he was wearing had a seam opening near the left toe that collected snow and cold water. Deja never asked for anything which was the kind of quiet that worried Darnell more than noise, because a child who has learned not to ask has usually learnt it from watching a parent carry too much. He went back to the store on a Tuesday morning and walked the aisles again with a smaller list. He bought boots in the size he had confirmed by measuring the pair Cody left on the Okafaz's front mat against a ruler. He found a winter jacket for a 14-year-old in a cut that was not childish, in a colour that was specific and particular, not the generic safe choice navy of someone guessing, but the dark olive green that Marcus had paused on for a full 3 seconds outside a clothing store window on Darnell's street in October before walking on. He bought Deja an additional set of architecture books and a rolling case designed for drafting tools because a girl who is 11 and already knows what she is going to do with her life should have a case that says that her work is real. He spent another $360. He left those things too in the night, same porch, same cardstock, same round handwriting. When you have done something for someone in the complete absence of any expectation, you know what it feels like when you drive home and the street is quiet and the work is done and you sit at your kitchen table with a cup of coffee. And something so steady it does not have a name settles into your chest. Darnell sat there for a long time that night. There was a third trip, and this one was different in kind. He drove to the gas and electric company's customer service office on a Wednesday morning, waited in the line that already had 6 people in it at 9 o'clock, and paid 3 months of the service account registered to the address across the street. The account had been past due by 32 days. He knew this because he had, in a moment that cost him something in how he thought of himself, walked to the Okafor's recycling bin the morning after he had seen Renee standing at her kitchen window for longer than usual, looking at nothing, and had found the disconnection notice folded inside an envelope on top of the pile. He had not read anything he was not meant to read. The envelope had been open, but he had stood at that recycling bin in the grey morning with the notice in his hand and felt something cold and purposeful settle in him, the same thing that had settled in him 30 years ago, when he stood in a hallway and understood exactly what had happened and what needed to be done about it. He paid $1,214 and told the clerk at the counter it was an anonymous gift payment, and he did not need a receipt in his name. The clerk, a young woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at him for a moment and then said, "That is a kind thing," and he said, "Just do me a favor and make sure the account gets the full credit today," and she said, "Yes, sir, I will." He drove home through a grey December morning, with the radio off and the heat working steadily, and a feeling he was not going to examine too closely, because the examining would take something out of it. He was down to $412 in savings. He had his pension coming in 9 days. He was fine. He pulled into his driveway and saw Cody Okafor standing on the front porch across the street in his new boots, turning to look at the tread the way children study new things, slowly and with total attention, and the child looked up and waved at him with a complete and indiscriminate joy, a 6-year-old who does not yet know that the world has edges. Darnell waved back. He stood beside his car for a moment in the cold and watched the boy go back inside, and then he went inside too. What he had not planned for was Marcus. 14-year-olds, in Darnell's experience, saw more than adults ever expected. And Marcus Okafor was not an ordinary 14-year-old. He was a boy who had been the man of his family since he was 7, who had learned to read situations before they became emergencies, who had his dead father's watchfulness in his eyes, and his mother's composure in his jaw. The 3rd week of December, on a Saturday afternoon when the sky was white and the street held an inch of old snow, Marcus knocked on Darnell's door. He was wearing the new jacket. He stood on the mat with his hands in his pockets and looked at Darnell with an expression that was not accusatory and not grateful and not anything as simple as either of those things. It was the expression of someone who has figured something out and is deciding what to do with the knowing, measuring the moment the way careful people do before they commit to a word. Darnell opened the door wider and said, "You want to come in?" And Marcus said, "Yes, sir." And they sat at the kitchen table, and Darnell made 2 cups of tea that neither of them touched until they had gone, lukewarm. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window the street was still, and the Okafor house across the way had its lights on in every room. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "It is you, is it not?" Not a question by the time it landed. Darnell looked at the boy across the table and understood that lying was both possible and wrong, and that Marcus would know either way. "And that 14 is not as young as it sounds," he said. "I don't know what you mean." Marcus looked at him steadily and said, "The handwriting on the cards. You hold a pen the same way every time. I have seen you write my mom's name on the Christmas card you give her every year. The loops at the bottom of the letters. You tried to make it look different, but the loops are the same." Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are observant." Marcus said, "My dad was too." There was a pause that held the weight of everything that sentence meant. A 14-year-old boy keeping his father's name alive by inheriting his habits, and then, because he was 14, and because he had been carrying an enormous thing alone for 3 weeks, and because some weights are too much even for boys, who have learned to carry a great deal, Marcus put his hands flat on the table and his voice broke. Just once, quickly, before he steadied it. And he said, "Thank you." He said, "Not for me. For her. She has not been sleeping. I can hear her through the wall at night." Darnell said nothing for a moment. Then he put his hand once, briefly, on top of Marcus's hand on the table, the way his own father had done once when Darnell was not much older than Marcus, and said, "I know. Your mom is going to be all right. I know that about her." And Marcus nodded. And neither of them said anything more about it for that visit. And Marcus went home in his new jacket through the inch of old snow, and Darnell sat with his cold tea and the shoebox on the shelf behind him that held a crayon drawing of a police officer with a badge the size of his chest and a smile that used up half his face. Marcus kept the secret until the day after Christmas, and then he told his mother. Renee came across the street on the morning of December 27th, with her coat buttoned to the collar and her breath coming in small white clouds and her eyes already bright before she said a single word. Darnell opened the door, and she stood on his porch and said, "Darnell," he said, "Renee." She said, "You did not have to do that," and he said, "I know," and she said, "That was your savings, the whole of it," and he said, "It was money sitting in an account." She looked at him for a long moment. She was wearing the same coat she had worn for 2 winters. The charcoal wool one with the loose second button she kept meaning to fix, and she had her hands in her pockets and her chin up, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at someone's who has done something that cannot be undone and must be reckoned with. She said, "I am going to pay you back every penny." And he said, "No, you are not." And she said, "Darnell, yes, I am." And he said, "Renee, what you are going to do is what you do every day, which is take care of your children and get yourself to work and keep your lights on, and that is more than enough." She looked at him for another long moment. Then the composure she had kept for 7 years of mornings she had gotten through alone gave way all at once, not in pieces, but entirely, the way a river goes over, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and made a sound that had no dignity in it and was all the more true for that. He did not move to stop it and did not say anything useful and did not reach out, because sometimes a person's grief and relief and gratitude are not yours to manage, and the only honest thing you can do is stand in their presence and let it be real. The December cold came up off the street, and the bare tree in the oak of his yard moved once in the wind and then was still. When she was done, she wiped her face with both hands and looked at him and said, "I don't know why you did this." He said, "Yes, you do." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I suppose I do." She went home. He went inside. He stood at his kitchen window for a while and looked at the street, both sides of it, the years on both sides of it, and something in the silence felt like an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. He thought the story was finished then. He was wrong. The 4th Precinct's annual winter gathering was on the second Saturday of January, and Darnell had stopped attending 3 years ago, not from bitterness, but from the natural drift that retirement carries you through, away from the rhythm of a life you no longer live inside. He had kept in touch with 2 men, his old partner Ray, who had retired 6 months before him, and now drove his grandchildren to school and called Darnell every other week to complain about his knees, and a detective named Cooper, who had worked property crimes in the adjacent unit for 15 years and always brought the better coffee to briefings, the kind from a diner 3 blocks from the precinct that no one else thought to stop for. Cooper called him the first week of January. He said, "Darnell, someone has been talking." Darnell said, "Talking about what?" Cooper said, "About what you did across the street for Christmas." He said the story had moved, the way stories move inside a precinct, which is the way water moves, finding every crack and filling it without announcement. Ray had heard it from Marcus's school guidance counselor, who was the sister of a dispatcher at the 4th named Lorraine. Lorraine had mentioned it to Cooper during a shift overlap. Cooper had mentioned it to the precinct captain, Lieutenant Simone Tate, who had come up through the ranks in the same decade Darnell had, and who had, in those years, developed a precise understanding of what it meant when a did something right, and did it where no one was watching. Darnell said, "Cooper, I did not do it for the precinct to know about." Cooper said, "I know that." He said, "That is exactly why they want to know about it." Lieutenant Tate called him herself on a Wednesday evening. She was a woman of economy, not given to long speeches or sentiment that required qualification, which was one of the things Darnell had always respected about her, the way she could state a thing plainly and let it stand without decoration. She said, "I heard what you did." He said it was a private matter. She said, "I understand that," and then she told him what she had decided. The 4th Precinct's Benevolent Fund held $12,000 that had accumulated across years from fundraisers, from collections passed at retirement parties and memorial services, from small donations entered by officers who had been around long enough to know that money set aside for the right moment earns more than interest. The fund had not been dispersed in 2 years. There had been no circumstance that called for it quite the way this one did, which was the exact word Lieutenant Tate used, quietly, the way she said everything. She said she had put it to the active membership and to the retired officers on the contact list, and the vote had been unanimous, which she said meant every single person, including 2 officers who never agreed on anything. The fund was going to the Okafor family, in Darnell Price's name, a gift from the men and women of the 4th to a family that one of their own had seen clearly when no one else had. She said, "You spent your savings, Darnell. We are not letting that stand as the end of the story." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "That money is for officers in need." Tate said, "The bylaw says community members in genuine hardship, and I have read it twice this week." He said, "Simone." She said, "Darnell." He said, "She won't want to accept it." Tate said, "That is your job. You know her better than any of us. Figure it out." He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. Outside, the January street was quiet, the dark coming down early and full. He looked at the light across the way in the Okafor house. It was on in the kitchen, on in DG's room upstairs, warm and steady and ordinary, which is the best thing a light can be. He did not sleep well the 3 nights between Tate's call and Friday. Not from worry, exactly. From the weight of something he could not quite name, the way a man feels when a private decision becomes a public fact, and the meaning of the thing shifts slightly without changing what it was. He had not done it for the recognition. He had done it because it was there to be done, and he was the person standing closest to it. That is the simplest version of the truth, and also the most complete one. On Friday morning, he sat at his kitchen table for an hour before he went across the street, drinking his coffee and looking at the shoebox on the shelf and thinking about the kind of man his father had been, a machinist who worked 30 years at a plant that closed 6 months before his retirement, would have vested, who never once expressed bitterness about it in front of his children, who went and found other work and paid what needed paying and never asked to be seen doing it. Darnell had spent a long time learning what his father already knew, that the doing was the whole of it, and the being seen was something that happened to you whether you wanted it or not, and what mattered was that when it happened, you had nothing to be ashamed of in the light. He had nothing to be ashamed of. He walked across the street that Friday evening, with his hands in his coat pockets, and knocked 3 times the way he always did. Renee answered the door with a dish towel over one shoulder, and a look on her face that said she already understood something was coming and had already squared herself to receive it with dignity, whatever it was. He told her plainly and without preamble, the way he had always found most respectful when telling someone something they needed to hear. He told her the precinct had voted, that the fund was hers, that it was not charity in the sense she was already composing her refusal around, but was something more specific and harder to decline. The formal recognition by a community of people who had dedicated their working lives seeing what mattered, that what she had built and maintained and carried alone on Calder Street for 7 years was worth seeing and worth honouring. Renee stood in the doorway and looked at him, and said nothing for long enough that Deja appeared at her shoulder to see what was happening. And then Marcus came up behind them both, and then Cody pressed into the space between his mother's hip and the doorframe and looked up at Darnell with his round face and said, "Are you giving us more presents?" And Darnell said something like that, and Cody said, "Because we still have the ones from before. We did not open them all yet, because Mom said we should make them last." And there was a moment, just a moment, where Renee laughed, a real laugh, and the laugh broke immediately into something wet, and she covered her face with the dish towel. And Marcus put his hand flat on her back the way a grown man does, and Deja said, "Mom," in the voice of an 11-year-old who has witnessed her mother's strength for so long that she does not know what to do when it cracks. And Cody, not understanding the room but reading it perfectly the way young children sometimes do, reached up and took his mother's other hand and held it. Darnell stood in the doorway of that family and watched them hold each other in the January, cold and understood, as clearly as he had ever understood anything, that what he had given was not the money. The money was just the evidence that what they were was worth witnessing. The precinct's winter gathering was the following Saturday. Not a ceremony, because Darnell would not have to a ceremony. It was the regular event, the kind with too much food and Ray holding court beside the coffee urn, telling a story told he had told 3 times as before, to people who were listening as if they had not heard it, and a dozen conversations running at once in a room that smelled of whatever Detective Moss brought every year from his grandmother's kitchen in Savannah, something in a foil pan that required no explanation and got none. Lieutenant Tate had said, "Just come," and Darnell had come, and when he walked through the door the room did not go quiet, and there was no applause, because these were police officers, and a police officer does not perform recognition, they deliver it. What happened was particular and specific. Ray walked over first and gripped his hand and said, "You are a piece of work, Price." And Darnell said, "Leave it alone," and Ray said, "Not a chance," and held his hand for an extra moment before letting go. Cooper appeared with 2 cups of the good coffee, the diner kind, and pressed one into Darnell's hand without a word, the way Cooper had been doing since the mid-90s whenever something mattered but did not need to be said out loud. Lieutenant Tate crossed the room and shook his hand, and held it with both of hers for a moment and looked at him with an expression that was precise and complete and did not require language. The dispatcher Lorraine's told Darnell she was sorry it had gotten out, and he said it was all right, and she said, "Marcus is a good kid," and Darnell said, "Yes, he is. He is going to be all right." He stood in that room for 2 hours and ate too much and talked about the things you talk about, among people who understand the shape of the work you did for 3 decades, and the cost it quietly extracted, and the thing it quietly gave back, which is the knowledge that the world can be held to something if you are willing to hold it. He felt, standing in that room with a coffee in his hand, something he had not felt in 3 years. He felt that the work had not ended when he turned in his badge. It had only changed its hours. 3 months later, in March, Renee was offered a full-time care coordination position at a small home health agency whose director had heard about her from Mrs. Clifton's family, who had watched, across 2 years of early mornings and late evenings, what a person could bring to a room when they brought themselves entirely. The salary was $41,000 a year, the first benefits package that had covered all 3 children since Jerome died. She called Darnell the evening she accepted the offer, and her voice had the quality of a person who has set something heavy down and is still getting used to the feeling of empty hands. She said, "Darnell, I need you to know that this happened because I kept showing up," he said. "I know that." She said, "You did not get me this job." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I just needed to say it out loud because I need it to be true in the way it's true when you say it." He said, "It is true." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Marcus told me something. The morning after he came to see you at Christmas." He said, "What did he tell you?" She said he came home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. And when she asked him what was wrong, he said nothing was wrong. And then, after a minute, he said, "Mum, that Matt across the street, he sees us. Just that, nothing more." Darnell held the phone and said nothing for a while. The kitchen was quiet around him, the house its ordinary self, the shoebox on its shelf where it had always been. He said, "Your son is going to be fine, Renee," she said. "I know he is." She said, "Good night, Darnell." He said, "Good night." He set the phone on the table and sat in the quiet kitchen on Calder Street, with the evening coming through the window in its ordinary way, and looked across the street at the Okafor house. Every light was on. Deja's desk lamp was a warm square on the upper floor. Cody's light was on, though at almost 7 he would be asleep inside the hour. The kitchen window glowed the same amber it had always glowed, the colour of a house where someone was home and the heat was on and dinner had been made. He sat there for a long time and did not think about anything in particular. He reached to the shelf behind him and took down the shoebox and opened it and looked at the card inside, the one with the oversized badge and the smile that took up half the face, and the careful block letters, "You kept us safe." He had carried that card for 33 years. He set it back in the box and set the box back on the shelf and looked once more at the lights across the street and thought, that is enough. It was. The lights were on. All of them, everyone. If you have ever done something for someone who did not ask for it, and did not know it was you, and only learned later what you had chosen to give, you understand that the feeling does not live in their gratitude. It lives before the gratitude, in the quiet moment when you make the choice alone and no one can see it and you choose anyway, because that is simply who you are. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below, because someone who needed to know that men like this still exist may be watching right now, and a word from you might be the thing that stops them long enough to remember. There are more stories like this one here, more people who were seen when the world was not looking. And if you have come this far, you already know why they are worth your time.